Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to AIJAC Live Online. My name is Joel Burney, and it is fantastic to have you with us this afternoon. As usual, ladies and gentlemen, sorry, I've just got to mute that. As usual, we normally advertise our upcoming webinars. We're in the final process of finalizing the details for our next couple of webinars to come up before the end of the year. So whilst we all still have a little bit of time on our hands while we're in lockdown in the Eastern Seaboard in Australia, AIJAC Live Online hopes to give you some thorough entertaining analysis from the best and the brightest that we have within AIJAC's orbit. So have a look into your inboxes shortly for the invitation for our next webinar. During today's session, ladies and gentlemen, we will be hosting a Q&A feature. Jeremy Jones will be hosting that and moderating the Q&A today, and he'll go through the raised hand feature inside Zoom that will allow you to facilitate being able to ask a question to our distinguished guest. Now, apologies while I get my notes. Now to the main event, ladies and gentlemen. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce two fantastic speakers to you. The first cab off the rank will be Dr. Karen Mock. Dr. Karen Mock is an educational psychologist, teacher, educator, and equity diversity facilitator. She's the former executive director of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada and of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Considered a pioneer in her field, she developed and taught the first course in Canada on multicultural anti-racist teacher education. Dr. Mock has been qualified by the Canadian courts and tribunals as an expert on human rights, discrimination, racism, anti-Semitism, hate crime, and hate group activity. Karen is currently the president of J-Space Canada, raising the progressive Jewish voice. Karen was the founder and co-chair of the International Jewish Caucus for the lead up to the participation in the UN World Conference Against Racism, and was on the official Canadian delegation in Durban, South Africa in 2001. Our second speaker is Professor Irwin Cotler, who is the International Chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and longtime Member of Parliament, and an international human rights lawyer. A constitutional and comparative law scholar, Professor Cotler is the author of numerous publications and seminal legal articles, and has written upon and intervened in landmark Charter of Rights cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, minority rights, peace law, and war crimes justice. A leading parliamentarian on the global stage, he has been chair of the Inter-Parliamentary Group for Human Rights in Iran, chair of the Inter-Parliamentary Group of Justice for Sergei Magnitsky, chair of the All-Party Save Darfur Parliamentary Coalition, chair Canadian section of the Parliamentarians for Global Action, and members of its International Council. Now, with all that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to announce that today's topic is the 2001 World Conference Against Racism and the Challenge of Anti-Semitism Today. Now, my pleasure, as usual, to hand over to AIJAC's Executive Director, Dr. Colin Rubenstein, to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Joel, and welcome to everybody to this very special event, and particularly to our eminent guests, Professor Irwin Cotler, a very old friend, and the very impressive Dr. Karen Mock. Now, we're meeting just 2 weeks after yet another infamous Durban meeting, this time Durban 4, which took place in New York just a couple of weeks ago, echoing Durban 1 of 20 years ago, which turned out to be, as we all know, an anti-Semitic hate fest. Happily, over 3 dozen honourable nations boycotted that meeting 2 weeks ago, including Australia and Canada, the first couple of countries off the rank leading the way, as we would expect. But unfortunately, we know we are witnessing globally a resurgence of the oldest hatred, often in new guises, of course, the new anti-Semitism, as we know it, which attacks the very legitimacy of the collective of the Jewish people, Israel, delegitimizing, demonizing, defaming the Jewish state in all sorts of creative and negative ways, as we know. And this stretches right across the spectrum, from the far right to Islamists of many stripes, and of course encompasses much of the progressive far left. So there are new challenges for the Jewish world, and it's not just us. It's definitely for the entire civilized democratic world, which wants to continue to practice and respect and wishes to maintain open and free and tolerant societies. So really, without further ado, Irwin Cotler is really a living legend with us today, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, together with all his other very impressive attributes, and Dr. Karen Mock, currently President of JSpace in Canada. These are genuine experts to take us through this topic of the infamous 2001 Durban conference against racism, which turned into be a racist conference, as we know, and very much pressing on all our minds the ongoing challenge of anti-Semitism and bigotry in general, I would add. So I turn the microphone and the screen, more importantly, over to our first speaker to open up, Dr. Karen Mock. Thank you very much for being with us.
I'm not sure where that's coming from. There we go. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for that very warm introduction. It really, really is an honor to be asked. I'd have to say good evening. It's kind of late in Toronto right now, which is where you found me. But it is really a thrill to be on this program with such valued colleagues. And I want to also say friends. It's wonderful to see Jeremy Jones again, who of course was in Durban with us. Jeremy and I met now almost 30 years ago when we were part of the, out of Tel Aviv University, the Antisemitism Documentation Project, and have been close colleagues ever since. We all felt in those days that since we were all being accused of having a Jewish worldwide conspiracy, we might as well start communicating that way. So when we did have our chat the other day, and of course to be on with Irwin Cotler, a very valued friend, mentor, and colleague, is just a thrill. When we had our discussion the other day, we felt that a good framing would be to look at anti-Semitism then, before Durban, during Durban, and today. And what actually happened in Durban that even changed the nature of how we, as a literally worldwide Jewish community, are impacted by anti-Semitism and continue to be. One of the things that I do share with Jeremy and with Irwin, and of course also with Joel, I should have mentioned Joel's role there as well. One of the things we do share is the importance of the anti-racism work and the intercultural and the interfaith work that we all do in our community. We often say, when one is aggrieved, we're all aggrieved. And that is why I think we were all so looking forward and feeling optimistic about what was to be the third UN conference against racism and all forms of related intolerance. Many of us were excited because, yes, we have been working together to counter anti-Semitism, but we've also been working with our human rights partners, the human rights defenders worldwide, in a collegial way to counter anti-Semitism, the white supremacy, the hate crimes, and some of the rising anti-Semitism we found in other sectors as well, including, as we know, from what we might call, for want of better language, the very far left. But it seemed somehow to be manageable then. We had our definitions of anti-Semitism, at least we could recognize it. I, at the time, was head of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada, and we would sometimes struggle. Was this accusation anti-Semitic? Wasn't it anti-Semitic? But there was a general agreement then that anti-Semitism was a part of the anti-racist agenda, and we could work with colleagues. Canada actually was the seconder to having that World Conference Against Racism, the motion in the General Assembly by South Africa. And so the Canadian anti-racism movement, so to speak, became very aware of the plans leading up to Durban, and many of us began to work together. I was honored to have been appointed by our Secretary of State, who was the Minister of Multiculturalism at the time, the Honorable Hetty Fry, who headed the Canadian delegation. I was honored to have been asked to chair the Canadian Civil Society Advisory Committee for the 2 years leading up to Durban, the advisory committee to the Canadian government on who should go, who shouldn't go. And we worked together. All seemed to be going well until the Tehran regional meeting. And that was when we became aware of the plans to bring back the Zionism is racism kind of language. We found that some of the Jewish applicants to be delegates to that Tehran meeting were rejected. They couldn't get visas. And so the writing was on the wall. I must say that at that time and in the lead up to it, and I'm not sure if Jeremy and Irwin and others and Joel had this experience, but in the lead up to Durban, when I was trying to get awareness raised, even among the mainstream, so-called mainstream Jewish organizations, I was told, well, Karen, anti-racism, that's your issue. You'll kind of, you'll keep us informed. But the major Jewish organizations were not connected in the lead up, those years leading up to it. And then Tehran, and then we all blew the whistle and people did get engaged. I reached out in a kind of a panic to, the way graduate students or new community workers might reach out to people that they don't know. And I sent to the World Jewish Congress, and I sent to Hadassah, and I sent to the American Jewish Committee, and Simon Wiesenthal International, B'nai B'rith International, saying, I introduced myself. I said that we were getting ready for the PrepComs and the NGO forum in Geneva, and who was going for your organization, because we need to start to strategize. And this was regrettably just after, it was only a few months before, but the network internationally started. And at the first gathering in Geneva of the NGOs who were getting ready and being briefed, that's where we learned officially, that we had to have a caucus if we were going to have a voice and be able to even speak to the General Assembly at the time. And that's what we did. We found each other at the NGO forum, at the NGO PrepCom rather, and realized then and there, because of the treatment that we began to get when there was a drafting started for the declaration, that anti-Semitism would be alive and well at this conference. I think, to be fair, we were shocked with the actual vitriol that we experienced in Durban itself. In the PrepCons, at least, people had to be civil because we were in the Palais Wilson, and you had to be civil, even though I had to go and beg the NGO coordinating committee for us to be able to have an anti-Semitism commission, because they weren't even going to consider having anti-Semitism dealt with in this conference on related intolerance to racism. But they agreed that it would be discriminatory. And so we got to have an anti-Semitism commission, which meant that we could actually draft sections of the NGO declaration going forward. Of course, some of us were also on the official Canadian delegation, the government delegation as NGOs. And so we were also going prepared to do our strategic lobbying and work together that way as well. I remember when Shimon Samuels and I from the, he was from Wiesenthal in France, we went to observe the NGO International Coordinating Committee having its meeting, because it's open and any NGO can go if you're ECOSOC, if you have ECOSOC standing. And one of the delegates who claimed to be a Palestinian delegate interrupted the meeting and said they couldn't continue the meeting because they had agents of a foreign government there, and they meant of Israel. Now, both of us were on our country's official delegations. And of course, they let us stay in the meeting. But it was clear that we were going to have a challenge on our hands. Now I need to fast forward because I only have time limit. And I want to take you to Durban for those of you who know what we experienced. And I have to tell you, it's thanks to the European Union of Jewish Students and those who were there that they documented. They have the official documentation of anti-Semitic propaganda distributed during the Youth Summit and the NGO Forum. We were registering on the first day before the Youth Forum, and this greeted us at the registration table. This is the cover of a booklet from the Arab Lawyers Union that was full of vicious anti-Semitic caricatures that were just kind of updates of the kind of thing you might have seen in Der Stürmer, with blood dripping down from fangs of Jews and of Israeli soldiers. So of course the crossover to anti-Zionism and the crossover to anti-Semitism. At the registration desk, and when the Sangoko, the South African NGO Coordinating Committee, head of the whole NGO forum, opened up the 7,000 person forum in the huge stadium in Durban, she's wearing a keffiyeh in solidarity with the Palestinian delegation. And we were greeted with huge banners in the stands that were anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian. And you'll know that you probably all realize that I'm one of those people that says you can certainly be pro-Palestinian without being anti-Israel. But in this case, it was blatant anti-Zionism. And the media in Canada was all over it. You had the Naturi Karta who were there speaking out against Israel, the media with huge headlines that there's actually racism felt, and the saddest headline of all that was a reality, Jews forced to hide their identities. Thanks to the Jewish Students Union who did an amazing job of giving flowers out and singing peace songs. And we had press conferences and we did what we could. It was very, very challenging to counter the propaganda that was so well orchestrated. That is what I think surprised us most of all. And on very, very little sleep, thank goodness for the South African Jewish community that had us have a headquarters at the Durban Jewish Club, the Jewish Community Center. Speaking of the Jewish Community Center, another proof that this was certainly anti-Semitism and not just anti-Zionism or pro-Palestinian activism. The day that the government forum started and the NGO forum hadn't ended yet was a Friday, and we were preparing for Shabbat. I had to go and beg the NGO Coordinating Committee not to hold the final NGO plenary on Shabbat morning, but they refused to make religious accommodation. And instead, eventually, they decided to hold it after sundown. Why? Because the Spanish translation wasn't finished on time. So they made linguistic accommodation, and then that's why we actually eventually attended the forum. We couldn't get to our Shabbat dinner, though, because there was a protest. There was a solidarity march with the Palestinians to lobby the Durban conference. But this is the kind of posters that you saw circulated. Handmade posters too that said Hitler should have finished the job. Of course, the word apartheid being bantered around. This is from the Afro-Brazilian National Conference. People with no affiliation to the Middle East at all. People involved in anti-racism, but accepting the apartheid kind of language very publicly. Yes, it had started to be used a little bit before Durban, but this, of course, seemed to seal that kind of rhetoric and that kind of language. Now, I do have to tell you that why was it also such a struggle? Because the drafting committee for the NGO declaration had actually gone to Palestine. They said they went to Israel and Palestine, but they did not actually go to Israel. They visited refugee camps. And that was their gathering, their evidence gathering. And there was a South African lawyer who was one of the drafters. And I'll never forget sitting down with him and having a conversation as to why certain things had to be changed in the draft in Geneva. And he said to me, apartheid is the right word, because if you are not Jewish in Israel, you are not allowed to vote. I said to him, you're a lawyer. Where did you get that information? Do you realize there are Arab members, Muslim members of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset? So this was the struggle. The propaganda worked very well on people who were ignorant of the actual facts. I must say our Jewish caucus did an amazing job. The Jewish organizations pulled together to the extent that they could. And we ended up in the end, the people who were Jewish who were on official delegations stayed at the conference. The Israeli government was very pleased that we did, even after Israel and the US left, because we needed to stay to continue to do our lobbying and continue to work. And many, many, many people did. And we did participate in the final plenary of the NGO forum, but there were a different set of rules for the Anti-Semitism Commission, a different set of rules for the Jews. The rules in the NGO forum were that every commission could define its own oppression, its own victimization, its own terminology. And that when it came to amendments to be made to the NGO final declaration, one of the first amendments suggested by the Ecumenical Caucus, as a matter of fact, many of the larger human rights organizations woke up way too late to what was going on, people who really should have known better. And in the end, they made a motion not to accept sections of our commission's recommendation. A commission, by the way, which was stormed by pro-Palestinian activists, anti-Israel activists, who tried to end our commission in the tent. But we stood up to that. And in the end, Mary Robinson herself, because of the way the Jewish caucus met with her, exposed what was going on at the forum, at the NGO forum, she actually refused to accept the NGO declaration as an official document to be tabled to the General Assembly at the government forum as the voice of civil society because of the vitriol in it against Israel. And mainly it was on a technicality too, but because of their use of the term genocide in particular, which was certainly not in keeping with the UN definitions of genocide. And so in that regard, eventually at the government forum, even though Israel did say it could live with the way the final government declaration happened, there was only one section where Israel was mentioned, and it was mentioned in a context of self-determination and peace in the Middle East and that sort of thing, and bringing Palestinians and Jews together. But in the entire document, it is the only country named by name in that whole government document. To me, in human rights work, differential treatment of Jews is called anti-Semitism, and differential treatment of the Jewish state is called anti-Semitism. I'll leave it now because my time was short, and I know we're going to have a conversation of the impact today. For me, the saddest part is what this did and the divisiveness in the anti-racism and human rights world, where Jews no longer felt safe and equal and in partnership with our colleagues.
Professor Cotler, the chair is yours.
Thank you. I want to begin by commending AIJAC and Colin, Jeremy, all those associated with it for organizing this very compelling inquiry into Durban and its legacy. I just want to say that Australia, for me and the Australian Jewish community, I'm not only meeting up through this seminar with old friends, but all this is reflective of my own sense of kinship with Australia and Australian Jewry over the years. And I want to commend Karen. I thought her testimony was not only so compelling, but in fact, it relieves me of the responsibility for discussing, for example, the first theme about what happened before we got to Durban and things even that happened at Durban, because she did it so effectively and so evocatively. I must say, when I first heard in 1997 that there was going to be a World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, I greeted it with not only anticipation, but excitement. This was to be the first World Conference Against Racism of the 21st century. Indeed, this was to be the first conference on international human rights of the 21st century, with anti-racism as its overriding theme. And the conference was to take place in Durban, the birthplace of South African apartheid, where we could now commemorate the dismantling of apartheid, where in 1981, I actually had been arrested for speaking out against apartheid. This is now the 40th anniversary of my arrest, and my whole experience in South Africa, even then and since, has been an important part of my own advocacy over the years. But what happened at Durban, to use an oft-abused metaphor, was truly Orwellian. A World Conference Against Racism and Hate turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. A conference intended to promote and protect international human rights turned into a conference singling out one state and one people for selective opprobrium and indictment. A conference that was to commemorate the dismantling of South African apartheid became a conference calling for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. I have to say, as someone who participated in that Durban conference, I was there also as a member of the Canadian delegation, partook of the NGO forum, which, as I said, Karen really described so compellingly. Durban has indelibly imprinted itself not only on my memory, but on my being. I can still see the marches. I can still see the banners, the ones that Karen demonstrated for you, those that were associating Israel's with Nazis, Jews as racist. Still see these banners right in front of me, and I can still hear the chants in the demonstrations that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, but the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. On September 10th, I flew back to Canada, the eve of 9/11. I woke up, as we all did, to 9/11 and to a phone call that came in not long after that from one of my colleagues who had been with us at Durban, who said, and I never forgot these words, that 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, but Durban was the Mein Kampf. In fact, 9/11 overtook what had happened at Durban in the public consciousness, but Durban was there in the trenches, metastasizing in its anti-Semitism. Those of us like Karen and myself who personally witnessed the Durban Festival of Hate have been, I believe, forever transformed. Transformed by the pamphlets and posters of hate and anti-Semitism, as Karen shared with you. Transformed by the cartoons and the leaflets portraying, as I said, Israelis as Nazis, Jews with hooked noses, fangs dripping in blood, all the classic ugly stereotypes. The anti-Semitic tracts of the protocols of the elders of Zion were to be seen everywhere. We witnessed demonstrations with signs, as Karen demonstrated for you, that Hitler should have finished the job. We witnessed Jewish students being physically attacked and being threatened with, "You don't belong to the human race." I witnessed those attacks. I heard those comments, "You don't belong to the human race." In other words, Durban for us is a part of our everyday lexicon of racism, hate, and anti-Semitism, just as 9/11 is part of our lexicon of terrorist mass murder. Simply put, Durban emerged as the tipping point for the new anti-Semitism, but a new anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-racism and proceeding under the protective cover of human rights. It should not be surprising that this hateful Durban speak became a legitimizing instrument for a new wave of anti-Semitism then and since, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and since, as I said, evidenced by the following examples. I'll first deal with ones that really followed immediately after Durban. Jews, number one, Jews were blamed for 9/11 in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and continue to be blamed for 9/11. Just recently, we had graffiti in Montreal, resurrecting the old notion of Jews as responsible for 9/11. Second, a global campaign against Israel as a racist, ethnic cleansing, criminal, and apartheid state was, in fact, launched in the immediate aftermath of Durban, not accidentally, but strategically and organized. Third, the first meeting of the UN Commission of Human Rights in the aftermath of Durban singled out Israel for selective opprobrium and indictment, and more resolutions passed against Israel than the rest of the international community combined, giving the real human rights violators exculpatory immunity. Fourth, and this is not that well known, but it's an incredible thing, there was a meeting at the University of Michigan in November 2001 to launch what became the BDS movement. And what happened there is incredible. A resolution itself problematic that would say we support a two-state resolution if Israel became a democratic state. In other words, Israel is not yet a democratic state. That was defeated. The resolution that was adopted was a resolution condemning Israel for being a racist, apartheid criminal state. That in the immediate aftermath of Durban, launching of the BDS movement. And finally, and perhaps the most egregious of hateful and discriminatory acts in terms of international human rights and criminal law, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, which is the repository framework for protecting under international humanitarian law against war crimes and crimes against humanity, met for the first time after 52 years, the Convention 1904. First time they met was in 2001. The only state they put in the docket for the first time was Israel. Not any of the countries that were responsible, whether it be the genocide in former Yugoslavia, or those responsible for the genocide in Rwanda, or for the ethnic cleansing in Darfur. I can go. No state was ever put in the docket for 52 years until Israel. And I might add, twice since, in the legacy of hate of Durban, the only state put in the docket of the accused regarding state parties to international humanitarian law, Geneva Convention, has been Israel. 20 years later, the Durban legacy of hate finds expression not only in the old, new, global, virulent, sophisticated, and even lethal anti-Semitism, but also we have seen it metastasizing as a result of the Hamas war on Israel, what I would call the second tipping point in the campaign against Israel and the Jewish people, and where a growth of what I can only call demonological anti-Semitism, as I've described it, has been underpinned by 5 dynamics that we need to appreciate. One is the mainstreaming, the normalization, the legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture. In other words, the absence of outrage, underpinned by indifference and inaction. Dramatic change from the times of pre-Durban, as Karen described it. 2, the globalization of anti-Semitism. In other words, what happens in London and Paris finds expression also in Montreal and Toronto, or in Melbourne and in Sydney. I'll give you one dramatic example. When you had a convoy going through the streets of London with demonstrators, and some of them pro-Palestinians among them, saying, you know, F the Jews, will kill your daughters, a similar convoy also went through the streets of Toronto. So what you had in this globalization of anti-Semitism is not only has this globalization been reverberating regarding anti-Semitism, but it replicates itself in different capitals, streets, and neighborhoods across the globe. The third is the marginalization of anti-Semitism in the overall struggle against racism itself. The fourth has been the laundering of anti-Semitism under the very cover of anti-racism, of which Durban is the classic metaphor and message. And finally, we have the revival of classic tropes against the Jews as poisoners of the wells, where the COVID-19 is a case study where Jews, the Jewish people, and Israel are blamed for manufacturing the COVID-19 virus, for causing its spread, and indeed profiting from it in the classic anti-Semitic trope. None of this is intended to suggest that somehow Israel is above the law, or that the Jewish people deserve any particular preference because of the horrors of the Holocaust and the like. Not at all. The problem is that not that Israel should be above the law, but that is being systematically denied equality before the law in the international arena and elsewhere. Not that Israel should respect human rights, which she must, but that the rights of Israel deserve equal respect. Not that human rights standards should not be applied to Israel. They must be. But these standards must be applied equally to everyone else, lest we, as I've been describing, single out one member state of the international community for selective opprobrium, indictment, and condemnation. On July 21st, the Canadian government held the first ever national summit to combat anti-Semitism. I believe this is the first ever national summit of its kind held anywhere, and I'd like to commend to Australia the convening of such a national summit. This one took place in the presence of the Prime Minister, 10 government ministers, parliamentarians, leaders of civil society like Karen Mock, and we witnessed there, among other things, the lived experience, the lived testimony of students, of Jews of color and the like. I mentioned these two groups amongst the diverse representation of the Jewish community that found the expression there, because the Prime Minister and his ministers were particularly touched by this compelling testimony of the Jewish students and Jews of color, who described how they were being marginalized, bullied, excluded from the campus culture, unable to be part of the progressive human rights causes simply because they were held out to be white oppressors that were apologists for a white oppressor regime in the Middle East. And where you had women, Jews of color, and their lived testimony, they were in fact the embodiment of intersectionality, but where intersectionality has been turned on its head in this reversal of oppressor oppression. I have to say, and that is one reason I'm also commending a national summit, that following the sharing of these lived experiences and the compelling testimony of students and Jews of color, the Prime Minister and other of his ministers responded by saying that the combating of anti-Semitism will be a priority on both the domestic and international agenda of Canada. And as the Prime Minister put it, we will combat the 3 Ds: delegitimization, demonization, and double standards with respect to Israel and the Jewish people. I shared with the summit participants in my capacity there as special envoy a 10-point action plan for the combating of anti-Semitism. As I move to a close now, I don't want to burden you by elaborating on this 10-point action plan. This is a well-informed audience. I'm going to just identify in one-liners some of those action plans. I believe they're also common with respect to an action plan for Australia. The first, the imperative of Holocaust remembrance and Holocaust education, of the Holocaust as a paradigm for radical evil, as anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate. Australia, in fact, is steeped in Holocaust education and steeped in this kind of study, and this can be an important dimension that will underpin the combating of anti-Semitism. Second, the combating of Holocaust denial and distortion. For example, I can give many examples, but on the occasion of the Hamas war against Israel, we had 17,000 tweets in 1 week that Hitler was right. And we've learned that 84% of anti-Semitism on the platforms is not being removed. The third is the unmasking. We need to unmask the Durban legacy of hate, because this has been the launching pad for the continuing and metastasizing demonological anti-Semitism that we are experiencing as we meet. Fourth, we need to enhance both the adoption and implementation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, which remains the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international definition we have, and the most representative, democratically adopted over a 15-year period. Number 5, we have to combat the alarming rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes. In May 2021, we reached the level of hate, for example, of hate crimes, all hate crimes in 2020, which was itself the year with the most hate crimes ever in Canada. And this is true in Europe. It's been true in the United States and elsewhere. 6, we need to combat the incendiary and alarming rise of hate in the social media. And we need to use what I call the 4 Ps for that purpose: prevention, protection of the targets, prosecution of the perpetrators, partnerships of all law enforcement bodies involved in it. Number 7, we need to protect the security of our Jewish institutions increasingly under threat. 8, zero tolerance policy for anti-Semitism amongst any of our political parties. And it has to be called out not only by the other's political party, but in our own political party. Let there be no mistake about it. Anti-Semitism is the canary in the mineshaft of global evil. Toxic and undermining of democracies, as Dr. Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, put it in his landmark report to the UN 2 years ago. And it is an assault on our common humanity. Jews alone cannot combat, let alone defeat, anti-Semitism. We need a constituency of conscience for that purpose. We need to mobilize that constituency of conscience amongst governments, amongst parliaments, and we have an inter-parliamentary set of principles and precedents for that purpose amongst civil society, mainstreaming the IRA definition across all sectors and the like. And I announced this evening that we are going to be establishing soon, and I've been in touch with Australian leaders about it, an international justice coalition to combat anti-Semitism. An international consortium of the best of diplomats, parliamentarians, intergovernmental leaders, governmental leaders, scholars, and the like, united in common cause, combating the Durban legacy of hate, combating the scourge and hate of this old new anti-Semitism, and all this as part of the larger struggle for the promotion and protection of human rights and human dignity and the pursuit of international justice in our time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen and Irwin. Phenomenal presentations, and it's difficult for me to know exactly where to start in this part of the discussion. Being at Durban, obviously, I have memories, some of which might be worth sharing so people have some idea of the context. I was there leading the NGO delegation from Australia. So I was on the government delegation, but also in the NGO delegation. And the Australian NGOs behaved extraordinarily well. And our government was also outstanding in the face of horrific assaults on liberal democratic values. The Indigenous delegation, particularly from Australia, adopted me to give me some support because they saw what I was going through as a Jewish delegate at that conference. But that was rare. I was at a session on crimes against humanity. A woman with a South African accent, I'd never seen her before or since, asked, would there be an opportunity to ask questions? As murmurs started going through the crowd with people yelling out, Zionist dog, Zionist dog, the chair laughed. The woman left in distress. This was a UN auspiced conference against racism. Of course, the existence against Israel was identified as the only crime against humanity worth discussing at that session. When it came to the government conference, I must say something very significant. And the NGOs tried to present their documentation to make it a formal, the Australian government delegation immediately raised an objection and said, this report does not reflect what happened at the conference. It was not a place of rainbows and unicorns and butterflies. It was a place of hostility to Jews. And because of Australia raising that objection, it wasn't adopted automatically. The number of delegations of other countries that then came to the desk, the Australian desk, to say, we're glad you did it. We wish our government had told us we could do it, indicates to me that there were many people who knew what they were seeing was outrageous and wrong, but did not feel that they were in a position to do anything about it, or even worse, that their governments did not want them to do anything about it. And there's some interesting commentaries written about the behavior of the European Union as a delegation at the time. But I can tell you, Australia, it was seated alphabetically. So Australia was Armenia, Australia, Austria, Azerbaijan. We were glad when Austria was there, because to be seated between Armenia and Azerbaijan is not necessarily a pleasant experience when they're at war. But the Austrian kept saying, well, we can't do anything unless we caucus with all the other European countries, by which time things had moved on. So it was really, they were really quite embarrassing in many ways. I must say, the other experience, I was the only delegate at the government's conference wearing a kippah, even when America, Israel, and others were there. There were many delegates who therefore said, if you wanted to show support for Israel and Jews, you vote with Australia, which was something which gave me pride as an Australian Jew, but showed just how crazy the whole system was. But there were a couple of questions I want to ask before we move across to others. And the first thing is, there was reference by Karen, particularly, to the Tehran conference, which took place prior, the regional conference prior to Durban. Now, in the lead up to Durban, there had been conferences of the Jewish world where there had been celebration about the fall of the Soviet Union, the new world we were in, and an end to state-sponsored anti-Semitism. We were told there were no more state-sponsored anti-Semitism in the post-Soviet world. Yet we saw very clearly Iran leading a charge against Jews even from that time. I wonder if either of you, perhaps Irwin first and then Karen, want to say something about the role of Iran then and now in promoting anti-Semitism. Irwin?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I didn't mention the Tehran conference because Karen had referenced it, but there are two things about it that I never forgot. One was that Tehran conference produced the most scurrilous indictment of Israel since the end of the Second World War. There were 7 criminal indictments. What you mentioned about Israel as being a crime against humanity, Israel's not, etc. So the most scurrilous indictment of Israel since the end of the Second World War. The second thing, which is continuing to this day, is the standing state-sanctioned incitement by the Iranian leadership to hate and genocide against the Israeli and Jewish people. It's not well known, but the 21st century began on January 3rd, 2000, with a call by the Supreme Leader Khamenei saying at the time, and I'm quoting, "There can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state." He didn't even use the euphemism of the Zionist regime, without the annihilation of the Jewish state. That standing incitement to hate and genocide continues to the present day. And the reason I mention it is because the the Genocide Convention does not only prohibit acts of genocide, it prohibits also incitement to genocide. So in effect, Khamenei is engaged in the Iranian leadership in a standing violation of the Genocide Convention, yet no state party to the Genocide Convention. And we, Australia, Canada, we are under obligations to prevent and punish incitement as well as acts. No one has yet held the Iranian regime to account in the international arena. And I renew my call again this evening, as I've done before. We need to hold the Iranian regime to account, and we need to do so with all deliberate speed.
Thank you. Karen, would you like to comment on that or other issues related to Iran or other sources of anti-Semitism that you're finding are in the front line that you're opposing?
Well, it was very interesting. I recently had a long conversation with a colleague about so many people in the progressive spaces and in the anti-racism world who have no actual connection with the Middle East. And, you know, when in a country like yours or a country like ours, where people come from all over the world, he said to me very frankly, he said, well, he was raised in Pakistan and it was just automatic. As you were raised to hate the Jews and you were raised to hate Israel. And we're finding here in Canada that many of the people who are leading the charge against Israel and against Zionism and screaming and yelling against the IRA definition because they seem to think that it silences freedom of speech, just the way the white supremacists used to tell us that we shouldn't have hate laws because it silences their freedom of speech. And many of those folks have no familial connection or any connection whatsoever with Israel or with Palestine. And at Durban, for example, the only place where people in the Jewish community felt safe, that we could really let our hair down, was in the group called the Linkages Caucus. And in fact, I even met there with Canadian Muslim colleagues. We would hang on to each other and we would talk about how are we really going to try to show that we need to counter Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism and all of it together in solidarity when this is what's going on in our own colleagues in the anti-racism world, influenced by either the countries of their families or, you know, we used to say some people just have it in their DNA or it's in the mother's milk. Is that when we talk about, and of course, then the importance of real anti-racist education and the importance of, multicultural, anti-racist, intercultural, interfaith education, which is used in this country, and probably in yours, as a political football. And, you see people becoming very strange bedfellows, countering movements to try to bring people together, both from the far left and the far right, and saying, well, we should not do this or we should. And the divisiveness is undermining any of our efforts to really fulfill what I know have become Australian values and Canadian values.
Thank you. I just want to let people know that if you would like to ask a question, there is a facility on Zoom, reactions. If you go to that, you should see a feature which would allow you to raise your hand. I just have one more question. I see some hands have been put up already, or if you would like to ask a question in chat, and I have some emailed questions. There's different ways you can ask questions, but we do hope to be able to keep this discussion going a little over the hour and take more questions. So please don't be shy if you have something you wish to put to our speakers. But one of the themes that's come through with your presentations is that there are, in a sense, two competing tracks when it comes to anti-Semitism and racism. And Irwin Cotler may well remember, very shortly after Durban, there was a meeting of the World Jewish Congress, a plenary meeting. And at that meeting, one of the sessions discussed the two different places in which the global efforts to fight anti-Semitism or racism were coming up. One was the Durban process, which we had just been through, and it was much more a live opening sore than it is now, painful memory and something which shaped us all. The second was the process, the Stockholm process, the process leading to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the idea of liberal democracies or countries, mainly in Europe, but not only, also North America, Australia, a few others, coming together and saying anti-Semitism needs to be dealt with by not just Jews, but by governments and by peoples. And here is a process, here is what we need to do to the best of our ability and our best of understanding to combat it. So you had the Durban process in parallel to the Stockholm process. And I wonder if you, Professor Cotler, could say a little bit about the importance of a victory to the Stockholm process over the Durban process for the Jewish world.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Jeremy, because there's a real intersection between the two. I attended all 4 Stockholm conferences on conscience and humanity, as they were called. The first one in 2000 was the Stockholm Conference on the Holocaust. Then we had a conference on intolerance in 2001. Then came Durban in September 2001, as we described it. We reconvened in Stockholm in 2002, and we began the drafting. It had begun before the drafting of what became the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. And that drafting took place under the shadow of the Durban legacy of hate. And I participated in that drafting with Elie Wiesel of blessed memory, Per Ahlmark, former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, also of blessed memory, Göran Persson, then the Prime Minister of Sweden, Yehuda Bauer, and we produced, in effect, the first draft in 2002, which was to become the IRA working definition. The European Council to Combat Racism and Xenophobia took up our work as well. I was then Minister of Justice in Canada, and they produced in 2005 what effectively became the blueprint for the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. It took another 11 years until it was adopted. But that's why I say about the IRA working definition that it is the most representative, because it was adopted during a 10-year gestation period by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, civil society leaders, scholars, and the like. And therefore, not only the most authoritative but representative definition that we have, and what is not as well known as it deserves to be, that IRA working definition was anchored in human rights law, anchored in equality rights law. It was the perfect antidote to Durban. Just as Durban singled out one state and one people for selective opprobrium and indictment, an assault on the whole basis of equality law, so the IRA definition invoked equality law. In fact, it then found expression at the Inter-Parliamentary conferences that we had in both London and in Ottawa. If you look at the Ottawa Protocol, for example, it's an exact replica of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. It was adopted in 2010, then the definition unanimously adopted in 2016, and we're 5 years since then. So this is really a blueprint, the IRA working definition, a blueprint for protecting human rights, for protecting equality rights, for protecting freedom of speech. Those who say that this silences speech, it's the other way around. It protects the speech, for example, as I mentioned, of Jewish students and their supporters who are marginalized, bullied, excluded in the campus culture. And it continues to allow and protects the speech of those who want to be critical of Israel, and expressly says that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, and pro-Palestinian advocacy can be continued. The only thing is, it sets forth red lines. When you do speak of Jews and Israelis as Nazis, that's crossing the red line. And I just have to close by saying something. I today received a letter from a representative of the Independent Jewish Voices, writing me, and I will reply to it, saying, I don't see that the IRA definition silences my speech. I should be free to compare Israel to the Nazis. Very similar to what Karen was saying, what the white supremacists and Nazis were saying about their speech being silenced. So we need to, in fact, invoke and mainstream the IRA working definition. That is one of the antidotes and one of the responses to Durban.
Thank you. Karen, did you want to make a quick comment on this, or we'll move on? Karen, you're on mute.
I want to endorse the notion that we really do need to adopt the IRA definition. I'm going to add a little caveat, though, because I think that some organizations are overzealous in wanting to legislate the IRA definition. And it specifically is a working definition that when countries adopt it, or municipalities adopt it, or schools adopt it, it's as a tool to be used to assist in research to define what is and isn't anti-Semitism. But most of our countries have legislation already that defines hate speech, or that talks about racism or discrimination or human rights law and human rights codes. That is fine. I see, I noticed that one of the questioners said, shouldn't we commend those who had such an orchestrated lobby that they could do what they did in Durban against Jews? Should we learn something from it? Well, they're doing the same thing about IRA, and they're using propaganda techniques. They learned them well. When you repeat the lies often enough, people who don't know will just believe them. And so right now, I'm working with very valued colleagues in the anti-racism movement and in the Arab community and in the Palestinian community in Canada to analyze the definition, because they've just accepted the mantra, the way I guess we call it independent Jewish voices in Canada. You might call it Jewish Voices for Peace. They repeat it over and over and over again, that it's silencing their freedom of speech, or it's making pro-Palestinian activism against the law. And it's simply lies. It means they haven't read it, and they're mounting a deliberate, and by the way, that's very political, because as soon as a party adopts it, then another party carries on and says that they shouldn't. So I commend all of you that are advocating that this should be used as a working tool. We even have working definitions of Islamophobia that organizations have created. There's all kinds of effective working definitions that open up the conversation and allow us to see where the lines need to be crossed and what is and isn't anti-Semitic.
Thank you. Now we have time, unfortunately, just for a few quick questions. I see some hands up, which I'll get to as soon as I can. But before we go to our first question, Ovid Labelle from AIJAC, I just wanted to say that something about the two conferences, the Stockholm stream and the Durban stream. In Stockholm, I was also at all four conferences on the Australian government delegation. And at the second conference, I spoke on a panel about Holocaust denial in Australia. It was on Holocaust denial, the use of legislation, etc., to deal with this subject. And it was a very respectful, good debate about what you can and should do in response to Holocaust denial. The same panel was organised for Durban. On my way to give my speech, the police cancelled the session on the grounds they could not guarantee the security of presenters. Durban was so bad, we could not even talk about Holocaust denial without threats to our own security. But with that, I throw to the first question of Ed LaBelle from AIJAC. You'll give chance, Karen. Ed, please.
Thank you both so much for doing this. I wanted to ask you about the Durban 4 conference and whether you were more encouraged that so many democracies boycotted it or disappointed that so many countries attended. And is there any particular country that was surprising to you in either way? And do you think the trend is moving in the right direction?
Karen?
I think the trend is moving in the right direction, because if you look at, Durban 2 and then Durban 3 and then Durban 4, more and more and more countries are saying, no, the Durban framework is not the framework that we should be using and re-invoking. I mean, those of you that follow the UN language, you know that these conferences start off with saying, recalling the blah, 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 and reinforcing the whatever, and they've got all these preambles. No, we should not be recalling Durban. Durban was a disaster, mainly the NGO forum. Thankfully, the negotiations kept most of the garbage language out of the government one, but still, people conflate the two. And what it did with civil society is it was so divisive and so anti-Semitic that why would anybody want to, quote, recalling Durban and the Durban framework? So I think it was up to about 34 countries that said, why are we going to even bother with this? What we're trying to do is encourage that everybody should be working together to fight racial discrimination and all forms of related intolerance. And the Jewish community, and I'm not saying this just to pat ourselves on the back, we've been at the forefront of the human rights struggle and working with allies and civil rights partners and human rights defenders. I mean, when we look at the kind of work that Irwin is doing with the Raoul Wallenberg Centre, you know, speaking out and for violations against human rights worldwide, this is what we're known for. And the UN is what the UN is. It's what we've got. We've got to still work on the religious accommodation committees, and we should be there. We need to be there. If you're not there, you don't have a voice at all. But not for a Durban conference, not for something that tries to redo what was there. The countries did not stand up for social justice, human rights, against. The official title was World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. Most of the other communities were angry that the conference got so hijacked by the issue. You know, the African descendants, the Dalit, the Roma, the people that we went to support. And I'm not sure what it's like in Australia, but Canadians in the human rights and anti-racism world, before Durban and before getting really engaged in the UN process, we didn't know about caucuses along racial or ethnic lines. We would be in the education caucus or the health caucus, or we wouldn't even call them caucuses. We would be there with our allies dealing with human rights issues or multiculturalism, anti-racism and policing. Or we had the same experience as Jeremy did with the anti-hate session and hate crimes and hate group session at Durban. The topics were just completely commandeered. The people in Canada who went, it's because we do an awful lot of work on hate crimes with police and anti-hate. And the panel was commandeered into anti-Israel conversation and hate crimes against Palestinians. So no, not the Durban. I'm inspired and I am encouraged that more and more said, nope, we're not going to do it. And I don't know about Australia, but it didn't even get a blip in the media here. We should just ignore it, move on, and work together against all forms of racism and related intolerance.
Thank you. Professor Cotler, did you want to make a brief comment?
Yeah, just very briefly. There were, as you mentioned, 37 countries that withdrew from the Durban conference. What was interesting is that when we reached close to 35, I noticed that Sweden had not yet joined the group. And Sweden next week is hosting the conference at Malmo to mark the 20th anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration, which was supposed to have taken place last year because of the pandemic, was postponed. So someone has gotten in touch with Swedish authorities and said, look, you can't host Malmo at the same time as being present for Durban 4. And so I'm delighted, that the Swedish authorities understood that Durban and Malmo, just like Durban and Stockholm, don't go together. And I'm hoping that in the next week's conference, all countries going to that conference, Australia, can have to produce country pledges, undertakings as to what we are going to do to combat anti-Semitism, promote and preserve Holocaust remembrance. So I hope your government will come up with an important set of country pledges, as will ours. Second, while what happened at the governmental level, and as Karen also described, was encouraging, at the NGO level, it is still not encouraging. I say that because some of the major human rights NGOs who were complicit at Durban, either by their indifference, inaction, or even active participation, have not been amongst those who, in fact, were campaigning against Durban 4. Again, indifference and inaction. And finally, and this is still a problem, the UN framework for the combating of racism, which remains important, the combating of racism remains as a compelling priority, as Karen mentioned, still is under the Durban hat. We have to find another framework. We can't keep going Durban 2, 3, 4, 5. We have to establish a clear, unrelated UN framework to combat racism that is not tainted and is not part of the legacy of Durban.
Thank you. I throw to the final question to Dr. Zvi Fleischer. Zvi.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I just want to ask about the global trend that we see, including recently some issues in Australia, where people say the great threat of against democracy and human rights in various countries is that free speech is being shut down by claims that anti-Semitism is being thrown, stifling criticism of Israel. The Jewish lobby or Israel lobby is stifling criticism by calling people anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel. And this is legitimized, I think, a form of anti-Semitism, a very widespread form of anti-Semitism I had seen before. I'd like a reaction to how problematic you think that trend is.
Thank you. Now, we only have time for brief answers, unfortunately, but Professor Cotler's smiling first, so you'll get the first answer, please.
No, I think, we have had and continue to have a kind of metastasizing anti-Semitism. I referred in one code word as demonological anti-Semitism, the reference to Israel as being a racist, imperialist, settler, ethnic cleansing, child killing, apartheid, Nazi state. That for me is demonological anti-Semitism. And when people seek to pass off that indictment as being protected speech, well, the speech itself, may be protected speech, but the point is that it can be called out as being an assault on the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And why every other targeted minority is able to define for itself. And we have here not only the targeted minority, the Jews, but an intergovernmental body like IRA defining the framework, the metrics of anti-Semitism as to what does constitute anti-Semitism, while saying that criticism of Israel, tough criticism of Israel, is not anti-Semitic. But there are points in which you cross the line, and people then saying, well, that breeds anti-Semitism. That's turning law, morality, and fact on its head. And I think that has to be called out, because basically it's an attempt to launder anti-Semitism under the cover of anti-racism, under the cover of human rights, and even under the protective cover of freedom of speech. Let there be no mistake about it. Under our own international human rights treaty obligations, under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, we are obliged to prohibit incitement to hostility, discrimination, and violence. And that's what we are talking about. And that is not within the ambit of protected speech. And that is what IRA is also singling out as well, when it says we are anchored in equal protection and equal treatment of the laws. So both the equality rights protection, the international treaty obligation frame for us how to approach issues when, in fact, there's incentivization of hate speech against Jews, the Jewish people, and Israel.
Thank you. Now, we're well over time, unfortunately, and I'm very grateful for those who've been able to find the time to stay with us during the conference. But Karen, would you like a final 2 or 3 sentences?
Yeah, I of course endorse everything that Irwin has said, and I want to add the importance of quality education, anti-racist, human rights, social justice education. We have a very serious problem here in Canada now, that the kind of language that Irwin was describing that leads to what the questioner was saying, that the kind of comments that come back and the kind of accusations against Jews and their powerful lobby and so on. We have people that are teaching in the universities and teaching teachers in social justice education and human rights that Israel's an apartheid state, And many of them are so anti-Zionist that they have even eliminated anti-Semitism from the curriculum in teacher education. And then when they get into classrooms, they have no idea how to handle the fallout from a Gaza-Israel conflagration, because they themselves have been taught that Israel is a colonial settler endeavor that is racist and apartheid and genocidal and blah, blah, blah. So the vigilance that we have to have, and when I think of the solidarity among the Jewish organizations and the way we approach Durban together, I wish there could be more of that kind of conversation and strategic approach between and within the Jewish organizations, because the divisiveness within our own community often undermines our effectiveness in that sense. So you may have people that are wanting to go into the universities and blah, 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 and carry on and exacerbate because they're not doing it within the culture of the university. Or so we do really need to ourselves be more strategic. And there's a role for all of us in the whole gamut of the Jewish community. I'm not talking about what I would call the very extreme right or the very extreme left, even in our own community. But wow, that more than 70% in the middle that really want social justice, human rights, multiculturalism, anti-racism, and combat anti-Semitism together as part of all that really need to be serviced well. And the non-Jewish students from early childhood education right through to university need to have a truly inclusive education, which many of them are not getting now.
Thank you. Just a quick word of thanks from me, not just to the two speakers. It's quite late in Canada, and you've got a number of Canadians joining us today as well. And I even see we have at least one person from London, so we've got a good international audience. But I just want to again thank you both for such a stimulating, interesting, in some ways depressing, but other ways energizing discussion. But I'd like to hand over to Joel Burney to conclude today's proceedings. Joel.
Thank you, Jeremy. And ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. On behalf of AIJAC, a very, very wholehearted thank you to both Karen and to Irwin for what a fantastic and stimulating webinar this has been. I appreciate you staying on a little bit longer as well for the audience too. So again, on behalf of AIJAC, thank you so much for your time today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us today. As I told you at the top of the hour that there would be an invitation in your inbox shortly for our next webinar within the AIJAC Live Online series. Thank you, Jeremy, for your additions today, and to our international audience, please be on the lookout for future AIJAC events. Until then, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you then.